being here. I'm excited to be with you again tonight on this Wednesday evening. Excited to have our audience from the YouTubers who are going to watch this when it gets posted online. I have to admit I'm a little intimidated today because we're going to be talking later on about God's hardening of Pharaoh's heart. That was a very difficult study for me to go through this week, trying to think through how am I going to explain this? How can I possibly explain something which seems so mysterious? But we'll talk a little bit about it, and hopefully it will enlighten you a little bit with regard to, I'm just going to give my own theory about it, and then you can take it or leave it, and we'll go from there. So where were we? We had Moses called in the wilderness at the burning bush. Moses then told, go to the elders. Go to Pharaoh. He goes to the elders. The elders believe him. They worship. Remember, we said that the people knelt down and then they prostrated themselves, excited that that God had finally sent a deliverer for his people. And so then he goes into Pharaoh, and we see the episode there with the snake and the staff, right? The staff that turns into the snake. And we talked about how the name Yahweh itself, I will be who I will be, was revelatory of this kind of all the possibilities of the ways in which God would reveal himself to Israel in Egypt. And so we come now to a bit of a passage that looks like a break in the passage. It's a genealogy. You think, what in the world? Dealing with all sorts of call narratives and Moses being called by God. He comes before Pharaoh, and then it stops to interrupt and says, hey, Moses came from da-da-da-da-da. And it gives this genealogy. You think, okay, this seems like a break. But I don't think it's a terribly strange interruption. The scriptures provide a genealogy at this point for Moses and Aaron, both of whom are descendants of Levi, of the family of Levi, which would be later associated with the priestly tradition. And so these two individuals would be associated with God's priests, and they are in Egypt acting as God's prophets. And when they are told at the conclusion of when we are told the conclusion of the genealogy, it was this Moses whom the Lord told, bring the land of Egypt according to their military divisions. Moses and Aaron were the ones who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and when the people finally went, they would go out in military divisions. So these are, in essence, a kind of metaphor for prophet, priest, and king. And so when we've seen the analogies to the New Testament and the way that the New Testament interweaves the narrative of Christ, our Redeemer, with the narrative of Exodus, Christ going down to Egypt, coming back through the waters of baptism, preaching a Sermon on the Mount. He is a new Moses, a new prophet, priest, and king for God's people. And so wanting to tie that together, as you were saying about all of the scriptures point to him. Now, we come to the infamous plagues of Egypt. And what I know, bring it on, right? Okay, now what I'd like to do with the infamous plagues of Egypt is for us to do a bit of an exercise.
You're not using this.
Oh, no, go ahead. Is for us to do a bit of an exercise. On your handout, hopefully everybody has a handout. If you don't, please take a minute to go grab a handout. And there's some pencils back there because we're going to do an extended exercise. There's two extended exercises in this lesson. We've done a lot of turn and talk, right, where we talk to our neighbor and we process our thought, because processing thought helps us to embed that thought in our thinking and all of that. But we're going to do some extended exercises here, and we're going to go through the plagues, and I'm going to summarize them for you. And what I would ask for each of you is simply to listen actively and then write down, and there is passive listening. This is what my kids in class do all the time. It's passive listening, but active listening, and then processing, and see if you see any patterns or hear any patterns in what I'm saying, or what kind of things pop out to you. And then we'll talk about it. It's going to take a few minutes because we're going to read through all 10 plagues in summarized form, and so it'll be important for you to be active in writing and processing your thought during this time. Okay, plague 1. In Moses, first, do you have a question? Somebody have a question? No, I thought I heard. Okay, sorry. In Moses' first encounter with Pharaoh, he goes to Pharaoh early in the morning on the Nile River, where Pharaoh would go every morning, perhaps to bathe or perhaps to worship the river god Hapi. Moses gives Pharaoh instruction to send God's people out to worship in the wilderness and warning of what is soon to come. Aaron takes the staff of God and he strikes the Nile and so turns the Nile into blood. The fish die, the water turns rancid. Pharaoh's court magicians are able to replicate the phenomenon by their occult practice. And Pharaoh did not listen to Moses and Aaron. So go ahead, if you're not writing, now's the time to write, okay, while we're processing through there.
That is copying off my paper.
Okay. All right. Plague 2. 7 days pass. Then Moses enters Pharaoh's palace, gives Pharaoh instruction to send God's people out to worship, and warns him of what is soon to come. Aaron takes the staff of God and extends it over the waters of Egypt, and frogs emerge. Pharaoh's magicians, ironically, are able to replicate the phenomenon, thereby making the problem worse. It also begins to signal to him that they're doing something a little bit fishy, that they don't have the same power, or froggy, whatever you want to call it, but they don't have the same power that this Moses has, because this Moses seems to be able to pull these plagues back in a unique way. So Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron, asking them to remove the frogs and committing to send the people out to sacrifice the Lord. Moses then offers Pharaoh the honor of determining the time that he will rescind the plague. Pharaoh says tomorrow. And so then tomorrow the plague rescinds, it pulls back. Pharaoh then reneges on his commitment. That's 2. 3. The Lord then commands Moses to have Aaron stretch forth his staff and strike the dust. The dust turns to gnats or lice. Pharaoh's court was not able to replicate this phenomenon, but instead warned Pharaoh that this was done by the finger of a god. Okay, so what do we have so far? What are the 3 we have? First one? Blood. Frogs. And lice or gnats. Lice or gnats. Good. I'm not exactly sure what. A little bitty. Typically emerging from the Nile, which has now been corrupted, rancid, and you get all sorts of things. The frogs are coming out, and all of a sudden insects are multiplying. Then command Moses. So plague 4. Next, Moses goes to Pharaoh early in the morning at the Nile River, where Moses gives Pharaoh instructions to send God's people out to worship. And he warns of what is soon to come on the very next day. The next day, swarms of insects, possibly scarab beetles, possibly flies, will infest the countryside and Pharaoh's palace. Will not touch the land of Goshen where the Israelites live. He summons Moses and Aaron and grants them permission to journey to sacrifice within the country of Egypt. Upon further discussion, Pharaoh grants approval to journey to sacrifice a little ways further into the wilderness. He asks Moses to pray for him and Moses then warns Pharaoh not to act deceptively again. But as soon as the plague relents, Pharaoh reneges on his commitment. Afterwards, Pharaoh's palace gives Pharaoh instructions to send God's people out to worship. And he brings a message about a pending plague. Tomorrow, God will bring a plague on the livestock, but the plague will not touch the livestock of Israel. The Lord did this the next day, and, quote, all the livestock of Egypt died, but not the livestock of the Israelites. Pharaoh sent inspectors who saw that the Israelite livestock were fine. Pharaoh did not send the people out. Clarification. The phrase all the livestock does not mean all the livestock. They're going to occur again in a little bit later. It's a little bit like Moses striking the dust and, quote, all the dust turns to lice or gnats or something like that. It doesn't mean literally all the dust. It's something like all the world knows, right? It doesn't mean everybody in the world knows. It's something like a very large number of livestock. That's 5. Sometime later, the Lord instructed Aaron and Moses to take handfuls of soot from the mountain to throw it into the sky. When Moses does this, the soot caused an inflammation to break out on man and animal. Pharaoh's court magicians were unable to confront Moses because they were inflicted by the inflammation. Plague 7. Moses goes to Pharaoh early in the morning. Pharaoh gives instruction to send God's people out to worship. God tells Pharaoh that he could have killed all the Egyptians had he desired to do so. Tomorrow, hail will descend more powerfully than at any time in Egypt's history, and it will kill any livestock or person out in the open. Those who feared the Lord's word put their livestock in shelters. Others did not. Moses stretched out his staff, and thunder and hail came. The only place it didn't hail was in the land of Goshen. Pharaoh sends for Moses and Aaron and requests that Moses pray for him. He will send them out. But when Moses left and prayed to the Lord, Pharaoh reneged on his commitment. Plague 8. Moses and Aaron next enter Pharaoh's palace. Give Pharaoh instruction to send God's people out to worship. And they bring a plague. Moses leaves and urges them to send the men out, for Egypt is devastated. Moses and Aaron are summoned. They debate, and Pharaoh drives them out of his presence. Moses stretches out his staff, and locusts descend on Egypt the next morning and consume the plants. Pharaoh urgently sends for Moses and Aaron and asks them to pray for him. Moses leaves, appeals to the Lord, and the locusts leave the land, and Pharaoh does not send the Israelites out. Then the Lord commands Moses to stretch out his hand to the sky, and darkness descends on the land of Egypt for 3 days. Yet all the Israelites had light where they lived. Pharaoh summons Moses and gives him leave to journey and worship the Lord. Moses makes a clarifying request. Pharaoh reneges, sending out Moses with the warning that he will never see his face again. And then plague 10 involves the death of the firstborn, and we'll talk more about that later. All right. Hopefully, I see a lot of you writing. Let's kind of process some of the things we were seeing or hearing. What did you hear that stood out to you that you want to share with the rest of us?
Pharaoh doesn't listen.
Pharaoh doesn't listen. Okay. Clarify a little bit what you mean by he doesn't listen.
He pretends to understand, and then he promises, and then he does his own thing.
Yeah, that he does his own thing. Yep. Okay. Goes back on his commitments, right? His promise. Very good.
Well, how long time period is this over? Is this years, months, weeks, days?
I honestly don't know. The only time element that I noticed, and I may not have noticed them all, was between the first and the second. It was 7 days between those two.
It'd be the same period.
Yeah, so theoretically it's something, the number 7, of course, is interesting. As the number of completion or something, God is affecting his purposes. So probably not over years, but I don't know exactly. What else did you notice?
Pharaoh asked Moses to pray for him, and he always does.
Yes.
It doesn't work, but
Yeah. What do you suppose he means by pray for me? What do you think he means by that? Ask God to lift the plagues.
lift the plague.
Lift
yeah,
the plagues.
uh-huh.
It's something like supplicate on my behalf. Appeal for me.
Appeal for me.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Okay, what else? These are great observations. Yes.
There was a lot of me as a kid. You know, when you're like, okay, God, please help me pass this test, and I promise I'll listen to my mom and dad.
Yeah.
And my mom would say, go ahead, and I'm like, no. So
Right,
that's what
exactly.
reminds me of.
Yes. There's probably a little bit of Pharaoh in all of us, right? But we hope to rid ourselves of that Pharaoh, but there is something of that. Yes.
Well, I think that also Pharaoh was trying to dominate Moses, but he wouldn't kill him because he was afraid of him.
Okay. Yeah, it is interesting. Why doesn't Pharaoh kill Moses, right? What ramifications would have happened or something under that case? But clearly he doesn't. Okay, anything else? What about where these things happened?
Around
The,
the Nile.
the palace, the Nile.
They never affected Goshen.
They don't affect Goshen, right? Okay, Goshen is the land where the Israelites were living in the eastern part of the land of Egypt. Yes. Okay. Anything else before I move on? And
There's a pattern to them. The first 6 are large annoyances. They're not existential threats. You know, Pharaoh's going to live on, so he feels comfortable in refusing.
mm-hmm.
The last 4 are existential threats to the kingdom. And that's
Yes.
why God tells Moses, tell Pharaoh, look, I've protected you. I've held you up. I could have driven you with pestilence, erased you from the earth,
Yes.
but I didn't.
Yeah, I like that distinction. That's very interesting. Plagues 7 through 10 are in some ways existential. The Nile turning red and being temporary in some ways, right? But yeah, okay. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, we can. Anything further? Yep. God uses natural things in quite supernatural ways, right? Yeah, very good. Okay, all right. Let's talk about this. So we've got the plagues. We had 10 of them. They come in 3 cycles. I think some of you might have hinted at this or been thinking about this when I asked where did they occur. The reason that we know they come in cycles is because when you look at the stages or places where they are and occur, the first is the plague announced in advance to Pharaoh as he's in the morning worshiping by the Nile. The second is proclaimed in advance by Moses to Pharaoh while he's in the palace. Now, the word palace only occurs one time in the text, but there's a verb that says they went in to Pharaoh. And so clearly the movement is inside, not outside. And so that marks the second, fourth, and whatever it is, 7th, I guess it is, right? Plagues. And then you have, he's sent without warning, the third one. So in those, you won't usually have a conversation between Moses and Pharaoh. It's just like another plague shows up. And then what's Pharaoh going to do? And then it starts a whole new cycle. So any questions on these plague cycles at this moment or things you want to kind of process?
Is there a reason why there's certain things like frogs and locusts?
Oh, interesting.
Reason behind those?
Yeah, is there a reason to the types of plagues? That's a great question. I would say yes, and we'll talk about that. We will talk about that. So good, that's great. Any other things that you're thinking of, the questions that are outstanding in your mind right now?
Wasn't God kind of patient? He just kept doing this and Pharaoh didn't. I mean, I would have been over with it after 5.
Right, yeah. Yeah, God's patience with Pharaoh, patience in this historical moment with people. Yes, okay. And I think all those 2 questions, or those 2 ideas right there that are challenges, do in fact emerge through these plagues. The plagues tell us something about Yahweh and his relationship to the gods of Egypt, and I think we'll see some of that. They tell us about Yahweh and his relationship to Pharaoh. And they tell us about Yahweh and his relationship to Israel. So let's now talk about, having looked at those patterns and the cycles of them, let's talk first about Yahweh and Egypt's gods. Genesis 1 is clear. What are some things we learned from Genesis 1 about God? Creator. Okay, what does that mean? Makes things, and we saw how he makes things. Anybody remember? Spoken word, okay? Out of nothing, right? Because we talked about the distinction, even though it doesn't say he created out of nothing, there's a clear distinction between the language of create and make. He creates to make, to shape. He's creating out of nothing. So he is clearly outside of nature. This was revolutionary. Right, in human history, this is a revolutionary idea. We talked about ethical monotheism. He is transcendent. This is a great word, transcendent. He is outside of creation. He transcends creation. Transcendent, is it A-N-T or E-N-T? I can't remember. I think it's E-N-T. Is it E-N-T? Does anybody know? I should know this. I think it's transcendent with an E. He is outside of creation. And in that sense, in Genesis 1, he is spoken of as Elohim, God, creator, transcendent. The same God who also revealed himself to Moses from within the burning bush, revealed himself as I will be who I will be. And we talked about how that means he will manifest himself in the historical story of Israel in precisely the ways that he chooses to manifest himself. He is immanent. He is present. It says God comes down and he's working in history. And in this sense, he is Yahweh. And the names of God themselves in Genesis 2 come together to express this very idea, that he is above and beyond creation and yet operating with his people in the human story. With the plagues, we see how God comes down and bends nature to his will. He made nature. He can do whatever he wants with it. Now, there's some question about, okay, are these just natural phenomenon that kind of magnified? Maybe, but some of them sound pretty darn supernatural to me. And so it's probable to me that he's actually working in ways that are defying the principles of physics, the very principles that he embedded in the seeds of creation itself. But as creator, he can do such things. That's the very nature of a miracle, is that it's an act of God, something that you and I can't quite do, right? So God now reveals himself for the first time to large groups of people in Egypt. Formerly, who had he revealed himself to? If you think back in the biblical story, he revealed himself to Adam, Moses, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Now he's creating a nation. And he is interacting with another people, another nation to do so. He's revealing for the first time in the human story himself on a grand scale, a grand world-shifting scale. Here's what he says in the 7th plague, where God reveals to Pharaoh one of the purposes of the plagues. For this reason I have raised you up to show you my power and to make my name resound through all the earth. That is the spread of ethical monotheism. God is doing something so powerful that other nations are going to hear about it. They're going to know that God acted. Okay. The gods of Egypt were gods of nature. And this is not abnormal. This is, in fact, the normal scope of the way that religions work across the world. Natural phenomenon that people experience and they can't describe or explain, and they ascribe it to a god, some sort of power above and beyond them. That is not the Hebrew, Israelite, Jewish, Christian tradition. And so here, when God confronts Egypt in the plagues, he is confronting the gods of Egypt. He is confronting the gods associated with the Nile, for example. So when he turns the Nile to blood, or he sends the plague of frogs, he demonstrates his reign over the gods of the Nile, gods like Hapi, Sobek, and Heket. Notice their form. I mean, let me see my pointer. If you look at their form, it's so interesting. You have a frog, you have a crocodile. I'm not sure what he's doing there. I think those are the papyrus reeds coming up from his head or something like that, but all manifestations of a natural phenomenon. When Yahweh sends plagues of lice, swarms of insects, and locusts, he showcases his authority over the gods associated with insects. When he meets Pharaoh in the early morning to proclaim the swarm, one possible interpretation is that it's beetles. He conquers gods like Khepri, the beetle god, who represents the rising or morning sun. This is fascinating. The beetle creates out of dung a little ball. It's the rising sun, right? And it's represented in nature of every morning the sun was recreated, created anew. When he kills the livestock with Murren and hail, he shows forth his rule over the gods associated with animals and livestock, gods like Apis, Hathor, and Khnum. And when Yahweh brings hail and darkness, he overcomes gods of the sky and heavens, gods like Ra, the sun god. Okay? Do you see the connection? A God who is outside of nature, above nature, conquering gods who are only associated with nature, limited, finite beings in a way, though somehow bigger than men, but not as big as Yahweh. Yes?
Was there any sense that Pharaoh was deified?
Yes. And you're going to see that with the death of the firstborn. Because he is going to accomplish his judgment on, quote, all the gods of Egypt, man and beast. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, and God was over their gods then. He conquered their gods.
Yes.
Their gods are so important to them, but God was bigger and better.
Yes.
And conquered them
And think about where he conquered them. Where did he conquer them?
in their own area.
In the land of Egypt. So he is not a local God. Yet again, a very powerful proclamation, a statement about who God is. He's not limited to the Nile, localized with Egyptian insects. He is God of all. And his name will resound through the whole earth. In the Wisdom of Solomon, it says this: in return for their foolish and wicked thoughts, which led them astray to worship irrational serpents and worthless animals, you sent upon them a multitude of irrational creatures to punish them, so that they might learn that one is punished by the very things by which one sins. What's the connection that's being made there? What is the author of the Wisdom of Solomon connecting there?
I have a question.
Yes.
So by God doing this, is he showing the people that these gods do not exist, or that he's more powerful than these gods?
Great question. I don't think they were concerned with that question, though. But it's a very important question, but I don't think that was their question per se. Their question was that their gods were being conquered. So the Egyptians didn't suddenly give up their belief in their gods. Theologically, there are texts. Actually, I will have an answer for that. This is a brilliant time, actually. There is a statement in Isaiah, Deuteronomy, a few other places that says there are no other gods but me. But that's not what's said here. What's said here is this. I didn't plant that question, by the way. Right? This is how you will know that I am Yahweh, so that you may know that there is no one like Yahweh our God. This is not exclusivity. This is not God alone exists. This is God is unlike any other God you've ever known in the earth. That's incomparability. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just waited and would have my question answered.
Yahweh, who is like you among the gods? Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai. Who is like you among the gods? So that you may know there's no one like me. So God is displaying his power in very prominent ways. The God of Israel, Yahweh, rules in Egypt as he rules in the world. It says at the end of one of these plagues, the thunder will cease and there will be no more hail, so that you may know that the earth is the Lord's. It's a universal God. I don't mean everybody believes in this God universally. I mean this God created everybody. We also have something about the theology of opportunity here. The plagues tell us something about Yahweh and Pharaoh. When Moses first encountered God at the burning bush, he was given very specific instructions. We talked about this last time a little bit. The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, manifested himself to us. This is what Moses is to say to Egypt, to Pharaoh. Now, please, let us take a journey of 3 days into the wilderness that we may offer sacrifice to the Lord our God. This is a very polite, formal, stylized court request. That is what you would say to a king in a palace. And it's the lowest level of entry of a humble person coming to make a request. And then that is basically permit us to go on pilgrimage. But then in what we find that Moses actually said is this: send out my people that they may offer service to me in the wilderness. Now that is not so much a polite request. He starts with that, and that's more of a commission Yahweh's people, not your people, Yahweh's people, to go and on pilgrimage. And so Moses starts first with the second one, and then he follows with the first one. And Pharaoh responds in kind. So he gets the harsh request first. He says, I will not send out Israel. Then Moses said, backs up. The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, manifested himself. Now please let us take a journey. And here's what Pharaoh says, which is fascinating. Take a journey to your forced labors. Now I've translated that in the way that I wanted to translate it. Usually your English translations will say go. But then you wouldn't have caught the connection between those. Go is such a small word, it just goes over us. But there is a connection between those. Journey to your forced labors. That's where you need to go. God, you'll notice, deals patiently with Pharaoh. If you look at all of this, boom, 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 multiple opportunities to comply with this request. He deals patiently with Pharaoh, offering up multiple opportunities to change his ways. And then there's a third stage to all this. The Lord said to Moses, yet one more plague will I bring upon Pharaoh. One more plague, the death of the firstborn we were talking about earlier, and upon Egypt. After that, he will send you out from here. When he does, he will completely drive you out of here. Intensified. Not just going to send you out. He's going to get out of here, take the whips. If we got the whips of service, we're whipping you out of here now. Right? We don't want to be a part of it. One and all. Yahweh will accomplish his purposes. This is fascinating. Pharaoh had many opportunities to change his ways, make a different decision. He did not, and yet still somehow Yahweh accomplishes his purposes. Theology of opportunity. I don't know how else to say that. There's probably a better way, but it's something like God is sovereign and will accomplish what he wants to accomplish, and yet he gives people opportunity to repent. And we see that when they came out, in fact, they were driven out. There's a verse here that I want to share. I think I shared it last week, but it expresses very well this theology of opportunity. 2 Peter 3:9. The Lord does not delay his promise, as some understand delay, but is patient with you, not wanting any to perish, but all to come to repentance. Okay. Yet I know that the king of Egypt will let you take a journey only because of what? A stiff hand. A stiff hand. There's a real difficulty here. God deals patiently with Pharaoh, who resists him. God accomplishes his purposes. While Pharaoh will, in the end, send the people out, send them out under great compulsion. Pharaoh will not have repented. He will have relented. Here's the question. How can God accomplish his purposes against the recalcitrance of Pharaoh? Pharaoh will say, the answer is he'll do it through a stiff hand. Chazakah hand. All right. The theology of opportunity. Everybody, you got questions about that? Any questions about that idea? So the theology of opportunity seems to run contrary to another theme we encounter in this passage. I'd like to read this verse. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders that I have put in your hand. However, I will stiffen his heart, such that he will not send the people out. If God will use a stiff hand to free the Israelites and will stiffen Pharaoh's heart and thereby prevent him from sending the Israelites out, what sense does it make that God also offers numerous opportunities for Pharaoh to repent? Isn't it a done deal? Predetermined? If God makes it impossible for a man to obey him and then punishes him for his disobedience, is that unjust? You see the complexity, right? And now I got to somehow give you an answer. Well, you see why I have fear and trepidation this whole week, going, I don't know how I'm going to do this, but we're going to try. Okay, so we're going to talk now about what it means to stiffen the heart. I'm going to do another extended reading. I'm going to read the passages on the stiffening of the heart. And I want you to make observations. I want you to listen and look for patterns. And I think it will be enlightening. I want you to make the observations, not me. That's one way of exonerating myself from any culpability about all this stuff. Okay, here we go. So write down your observations on your handout as I read these passages. I think it's on number 2 on your handout. We read the first one, I will stiffen his heart. But Pharaoh's heart grew stiff, and he did not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. Then our plagues. And the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh is hard. He refuses to send the people out. But when the Egyptian magicians did the same things by their secret arts, Pharaoh's heart grew stiff, and he did not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. But Pharaoh turned and entered his palace. He did not even take this to heart. After Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh's presence, Moses cried to the Lord concerning the frogs that he had brought against Pharaoh, and the Lord did as Moses requested, and the frogs died in the houses, in the courtyards, and in the fields. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart, and he did not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. And the magicians said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God, or the finger of a god. But Pharaoh's heart grew stiff, and he did not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. Okay, you making your observations? Okay, hopefully you got some good ones. So Moses left Pharaoh's presence, prayed to the Lord, and the Lord did as Moses asked. He removed the swarms from Pharaoh, from his officials, from his people. Not one remained, but Pharaoh hardened his heart this time as well, and he did not send the people out. This one's a little long, so we'll just say, go to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says, send my people out. If you refuse to send them out and continue to stiffen against them, this word stiff, then the Lord's hand will be against your livestock in the field with a very hard pestilence. But the Lord will distinguish between the livestock of Israel and those of the Egyptians, so that nothing of all that belongs to the Israelites shall die. But Pharaoh's heart grew hard. He did not send the people out. What are you noticing so far? What patterns have you noticed? Pharaoh's heart is growing hard. And how many of these plagues?
And it
Yeah.
seems to be relief after each plague, so he feels
Yes.
emboldened to do whatever he wants.
Yes. There's an emboldening of heart, an emboldening of spirit. His heart is growing hard, right? Okay, good. These are all great observations. You also notice anything else that you notice? I want to give an opportunity.
Pharaoh heart, and some of them it's the heart.
What's that, Pharaoh?
Some of them seems like Pharaoh's the actor,
Oh, yes.
but some of them it's just talking about the heart.
Yeah, so kind of a reflexive Pharaoh's hardening his own heart, or his heart is just growing hard, but either way, there's a hardening of his heart. Very good. Okay, good. All right, and sometimes it's a stiffening of his heart, a hardening of his heart. There's two terms that are actually used for it. Now let's look at this one. But the Lord stiffened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not listen to them, just as the Lord said to Moses. Same stylized language. Look up here at the end. He did not listen, just as the Lord said. We've seen that almost half a dozen times in half a dozen plagues. But now, who's doing the hardening? God. God. Okay? That's an important distinction. Yes, ma'am.
So this whole time, I thought that God made him say no all those times, you know?
Yes.
He didn't say it to say, oh, well, this is what I'm going to do. No, he said it like, hey, this is what's going to happen.
Yes. This is complex. But that you see how complex this is. But it's very important that we look at the language, as the language tells us something about the theology of opportunity. I'm just going to run through these again. We'll just look at the blue phrases here. We'll make up a little bit of time. He hardened his heart. Pharaoh's heart grew stiff. I have hardened his heart. It's the second time now we've seen it, right? By plague 8. And then the Lord stiffened Pharaoh's heart. So what you were saying earlier about existential crises at the end is very interesting, because there's also an increase of this language of the Lord stiffening Pharaoh's heart. Okay? All right. Now, what does a weighty heart mean? It's either a weighty heart, there's two, Ad and Chazak. Both are used interchangeably as far as I can tell, but I want to offer my interpretation of what this means. So even when we see that Pharaoh hardened his heart for 5 times before you get God once hardening his heart, and then Pharaoh hardens it again, and then God does it again, and then another time. What does it mean to harden one's heart? And we've already talked about it a little bit in here, actually. What does it mean in Hebrew idiom to have a stiff or hard or weighty heart? To say that a person's heart is stiff or hard is simply a way of saying that he has become resolute in a decision. He has become resolute in a decision. Okay, think about that. That decision may be good or bad. A weighty heart does not mean I'm feeling sad or I'm heavy of heart. A weighty heart in this Hebrew, in my means that he has a lot of heart. He has made full choice of what he's. Does that make sense? Weighty means dense, a lot of it. My granddad died of an oversized heart. It's almost like that. Now it can be used positively or negatively. This is interesting. Kavod can mean to add weight to a situation. It can mean to make it worse, heavier, weightier. It can also mean to show someone's glory, to give deference to the weight of a person, to honor them. Chazak can mean to be courageous, to protect. It can also mean acting strongly to seize. And so in this context, Pharaoh is becoming resolute. What does a weak or soft heart mean? It means a person unable to fully make decisions of one's own volition. A person driven by fear or other internal psychological things, or driven by forces outside of himself. Weakened to the point of an attenuation of heart that they can't make a decision. That's not Pharaoh. He's making decisions. They are his decisions. Consider this example. If Pharaoh were to have let the people of Israel go, would that have been referred to as a weakening of heart?
In his mind, probably so.
Maybe. Okay. I think it would have taken him a great deal of courage to let them go, because entire economics of a nation are dependent upon it. A decision to let the Hebrews go with the risk of his economy that entails would have required great courage. So to strengthen the heart means to lean into a decision and a commitment. In this case, the decision was the wrong one, but he decided. Does that help? Or is that completely fuzzy? Let's stop and process that a little bit. Any thoughts? You'd like to? Yes.
When you said waiting for a stiff heart, are you saying W-A-I-T-I-N-G or W-E-I-G-H-T-Y?
His heart becomes heavier, meaning he now has, his resolution is steeled, S-T-E-E-L-E-D. It's become firmer. When he first encountered the plagues, he walks away, didn't take it to heart. Remember this? He walks because the magicians were able to do the same thing. And the second time, now he gets a little bit firmer of heart. Okay.
Would you say some of this verbiage carries on into the New Testament with stiff-necked or whatever?
Yes, yeah. I think there's a lot of kind of Hebraisms or something like that in the New Testament. And Pharaoh, of course, is mentioned in Romans chapter 9, and oftentimes in context of predestination or things like that. I'm not advocating against predestination, but I am in this context saying that really God knows in advance, but He is offering opportunity for human choice. And the human who's choosing is resolving harder and harder and harder to do the wrong thing. Have we not done that too? There's a little bit of Pharaoh in every one of us. Okay?
That could be a country music song.
That could be. That could be. I could make millions doing that. I better go on that route.
Beer and a trailer in there would be great.
Absolutely.
In the New Testament, you have this blasphemy of the Holy Spirit,
Yes.
right? This sort of unforgivable sin is that it's a hardened heart. You see the Spirit, you see God working, and yet you decide, I have this resolve that it will not be what God wants.
Yes. And you find yourself fighting against God. And so I thought of a little analogy to that point, not to make light of it. But let's assume an exhibition in Vegas between Pharaoh and Mike throws the first swing. Boom. Pharaoh goes back a little bit. Now, at this point, I'm out of here, right? The young Mike Tyson, by the way, okay, right? So there's a difference, right? The guy is strong, he's buff, he's at the top of his career. He's going to knock me flat if I go back in. I go back. Boom. Knocks me a little further back. And every time I have to steel my heart if I desire to go back into that ring. Right? I've been weakened. What have I been weakened by? The stiff hand of Mike Tyson. Okay? That is the cycle. What's that?
That's the hard bite on the ear.
The hard bite on the ear. I remember that one, yeah. Is that piece of ear found somewhere? Does it exist somewhere? Like a museum, a boxing museum or something? So I want to explore this a little bit further by looking at Pharaoh's concessions. And we're just going to go through here. Pharaoh says, then I'll send them out. If you'll just do this thing, pray to the Lord, remove the frogs, then I'll send the people out. Right? Pharaoh hardens his own heart. Take a journey. Sacrifice to your God within the country. I'm conceding. Okay? This is the point where Tyson hits you and you go back and you go, oh, okay, wait. I think I've won. I think you've won. And yet, when the pressure's off, Mike's walking back to the corner. You go, hey, come on, Mike. Let's go back. Come on. Right? He comes back, pops you again. Right? Resolution, resolve. Okay, so I will send you out that you may sacrifice. He hardens his heart. That's the little star. I'm guilty this time. The Lord's in the right. I'm in the wrong. Pray to the Lord. Enough of God's thunder and hail. I'll send you out. And he hardens his heart. And then before plague 8, take a journey, perform religious service to the Lord your God. And then we'll go on a festival with our young and our old, our sons and our daughters, because he's wondering who's going to go on this thing. Everybody's going, Pharaoh, including our herds and our flocks. There is nothing left behind to draw us back to Egypt. We're all going, because we don't know what God's going to require for us out there. We don't know if he's going to tell us to sacrifice bulls or rams or sheep or 100 bulls or 1 bull. We don't know that yet. But so we got to take our bulls. We got to take our flocks and herds. He says, well, wait a second. You can go out with your men. Your menfolk may go. Okay? Now God hardens his heart. The very first one is an unrestricted permission. Now he retracts it. But every other one comes with restrictions. He is becoming firmer and firmer in his resolve. And yet every time God is inflicting the hard, stiff blows, he's becoming weak. God relents. He strengthens his heart again. That is God using the stiff hand to stiffen Pharaoh's heart. Isn't that interesting? It's fascinating. take a journey, perform the service, yet again restricted. Only your flocks, your herds must stay behind. I have to have something to tie you back so you come back. And I love this. Normally, your translations will read, Pharaoh, Moses said, you must permit us sacrifices and burnt offerings. That's possible. But there are rabbinic traditions that I think are more right in this particular one, which take it very literally. You must give into our hands sacrifices and burnt offerings. Now we're not just wanting to leave. We're upping the ante. You've got to give us some sacrifices. Send us out with gifts. Further demand. The Lord stiffens Pharaoh's heart. His refusal. Never see your face again. And the Lord said, yet one more plague will I bring upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. After that, he will send you out from here. When he does, he will completely drive you out of here, one and all. It's ratcheted up so that now we're at that last punch. Tyson's going to swing and I'm going to go down. I'll still be awake. It'll be a technical knockout, but I'll tap on the mat. I'm done. I can't do it anymore. Go. You win. Relenting, not a repenting. Okay, questions? How was that enlightening for you to see that? Because I'd never actually thought about it that way until I delved further into it and looked very specifically at the Hebrew language. That was what was interesting to me.
Feels like theater, Bill. It feels like theater. Like
Yes.
God's kind of like, it's going bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah. It's a drama on a historical scale.
Yeah, it almost feels
Yes.
intentional.
Yep. Yep. And the interesting thing is, because God is outside of nature, God is outside of time. God knows the result. And yet God grants opportunity. Within the framework of Pharaoh's own impulses, his own orientations, his own dispositions, God is moving in a direction.
Is
Yes.
there a feeling in the language? Does it feel like when we're looking at it, there's like a provoking? It doesn't feel like, it doesn't feel like Tyson's wanting you to come back and hit him again.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. Although there are some moments where the language seems pretty firm, and you think, yeah, God's a little upset. Remember how he got upset at Moses, got angry for Moses, continuing to come back and ask again and again? Yeah. Yeah, he's not goading him or something like, ha ha, ha ha, right? Not that. It's more of, you're not letting my people go. You're going to need a stronger hand. Pop. Hit him a little harder. Keep hitting him down and down until finally he relents, because I can't take it anymore. My whole nation will be destroyed. Yes?
You know, I was trying to think of another time that another book where I've experienced this type of repetition, and the only one that's commensurate with this would be the book of Judges. Where, again, I agree with Matt, it's almost theatrical,
Mm-hmm.
the people sin against the Lord, they follow gods and Canaanites, and the Lord, enslaves them to another power. They cry out to the Lord, he sends a deliverer, a judge, and then the cycle starts all over again as soon as
Yeah.
they're freed again. It is interesting as you do read Judges, the ante goes up.
Yes.
It's for 4 years, then it's 8 years, and it's, so, you could also, you could draw some parallels once Israel crosses the Red Sea, that things are going rough, so they whine. And,
Yes. Yes.
it's
Exactly.
kind of back and forth.
It is.
As well, but this theater looks more like Judges to me.
Yes. Yes. And I very much agree that it's theatrical. I'm not saying that doesn't mean it's not real. Only that it's portrayed in dramatic, epic, sweeping fashion, like you would portray a great movie of the Exodus. Now here's what's interesting. You would expect that, of course, he says, So finally, take a journey out and bless me too. Like, give me a blessing. What was it said about the Abrahamic covenant? That all nations would bless themselves by Abraham, even Pharaoh.
Well, it also seems like there's some, like, God is portrayed as very patient and even merciful.
Yes.
He doesn't escalate quickly, it takes a while.
That's why it takes 10 times. And it ends up with the most severe thing he could possibly do. And that severe thing, with his foreknowledge, he knew it was a metaphor related back to the killing of the unborn in the Nile and Israel being the firstborn of God. I will take your firstborn, because you have taken mine.
Are there any other ancient tales of a God who's patient like that?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. Usually the gods are vindictive or wrathful or quick or impetuous, or they almost demonstrate the worst of human vices in their stories. If you look at the Greeks and Romans, for example. This is interesting. Pharaoh no longer hardens his heart now. Who is it that's doing the hardening here? The Egyptians, and I did this literally, grew stiff upon the people, urging to send them out from the land. That is, they hastened to urge the people out. But the language is to grow stiff upon. It's the same word. So now it is the Egyptians saying, get out of here. We're stiff-arming you out of here. Okay. I want to end with, because we're coming up to the last part here, with the firstborn right here. For on that night I will pass through the land of Egypt and will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human and animal, and all the gods of Egypt will I execute judgments. I am Yahweh. All the gods, including Pharaoh. Unfortunately, I wish I could talk more about the Passover tonight, but this entire context, this historical sweeping epic, has a liturgical force. All must be related to the worship of God. And Passover now becomes the beginning moment of the new people, of a celebration which they will commemorate with their children every year, and which Church Father Origen proclaimed, we were saved at this time in Egypt, so we are saved at this time now through Christ. The Pesach rite was taken up, transformed into the Eucharist by our ancient Christian brothers and sisters. Particularly at several points, the New Testament authors expressly identified Jesus with the Passover lamb. Our paschal lamb, Christ, has been sacrificed. Paul, 1 Corinthians. The gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, writing after Paul, directly identify the Last Supper with the Passover Seder, such that Jesus says the now famous words, take, eat, this is my body. Drink from it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant. He offers himself as the Passover sacrifice. These words have now become the words of institution. And this brings us to the final comment, which is that this is a grand story of history, but there is a moral story here. For each one of us was enslaved to sin. And it is only through the power of Christ our Lord that we are freed and taken into the life of God. That is a great exodus through Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you, guys.